Hi there, my name's 𝐸𝐵𝐻𝐸. I'm a licensed psychologist in New York State, and I'm also the co-director of the NLP Center of New York. I'd like to share a little bit with you about my background, my history, why I became a psychologist, how I work with my clients, and a little bit about even dealing with the pandemic. So just to start, I actually didn't know what I wanted to do when I was graduating college. I always liked to dance. So I thought I would dance, but that wasn't the way it worked out. And I started to look for how to make money. And I thought, well, I like people, so how about dance and people? And I started to do dance therapy, which was great, except, if I really wanted to pay the bills, I still had to find something to do. And in that moment, I was working for a nonverbal communication researcher, and I came across a book called Frogs into Princes, and that led me to learning about neuro-linguistic programming, which is basically what I work as a psychologist, is doing NLP and Ericksonian hypnosis. And I'll continually tell you a little bit about that. So at that time, I wasn't a psychologist yet. I started to learn about NLP. I worked with clients. My spouse, who's also my business partner, and I started the NLP Center of New York in 1986. So it's been quite a long ride. All through that time, I was working with groups, and one of the trainings was called Achieving Professional Excellence, and we would look for what our goals were in life. And one goal I had was to get my PhD in clinical psychology, and I hadn't done it yet. And it was really difficult for me to be in integrity with teaching people, but not having done it myself. So I decided at around 40 years old that I was going to go back to school. And now I had 2 children and a business, a home, and I was no longer that kid saying, how am I going to make money? Now I was an adult saying, hey, I want to get a PhD in clinical psych. And I started to figure out how was I going to do that. Fortunately, this is in the 90s. So, we know online learning was just starting, perhaps late 90s. I didn't have the opportunity to do an online education, but I did find what's called an external degree program. So I found the Union Institute, which is an external degree program. But what's most important is that it is accredited. There are lots and lots of online schools now, but you have to find an accredited program. And I wanted to be licensed in New York State. It took a lot. I've been a self-motivated, self-directed person all my life. And now said, I want a PhD. I'm going to go to the Union Institute. And I had to figure out how to get an internship, how to figure out how to get licensed in New York City, which I did. And I did it all. I got my PhD. I finished in 2000. Unfortunately, during 2001, I was in New York City. So I managed to deal with 9/11 and working with clients. And, as I said, I'll talk to you about the pandemic, but I've surely been aware of dealing with stress and anxiety in all these different time periods. What I'm describing, my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, my 50s. Now, in my 60s, I've had a long lifetime of working with clients and achieving my goals, continuing to work on goals, which is really the goals of wellness. And so here we are. So what is my methodology, or what do I do? Basically, I'm working with people to help them find ways to manage what we would call the presence within themselves, this anxiety, this fear, because the belief through the NLP lens is that any part of you, thought, feeling, behavior, is there for a positive reason. So although anxiety may be really, debilitating at times, when you have an opportunity to stop and take a moment, and I often think it's somewhere within me, right? Like within myself inside, that I'll say, what is that anxiety want or doing for me? And when you think of it with a positive intention, you'll find that it's often something that forces you to pay attention to yourself. It may be a moment of saying, this is my time. It may be a moment of saying, can I finally be nurtured? There's so many possibilities, but whatever it is, we look at it with a positive intention. And from there, we may ask ourselves, and this goes into the Ericksonian hypnosis piece, which is based on Milton Erickson, not Erik Erikson. Some people think about in psychology Erik Erikson, but this is Milton Erickson, who was a psychiatrist who developed his own style of hypnosis. And within the positive intention of, let's say, the anxiety or the fear, he taught, and what I practice, is that we have all the resources we need. So if you say, I'm feeling anxious, and then finding out what does that anxiety do for you, and you say, oh, it's forcing me to take time for myself. There's no other way I could do that. And then the question would be, what resource do you need? What resource within you? And it may be the awareness. I need to be assertive, or I need to be more compassionate, or I need to be more playful. There's so many ways of identifying resources. Then the best part, which I really like to do with clients, is be able to access that resource. So what does that mean? Take a moment, think about a time that you had compassion, self-compassion, where, when, and allow yourself to go back. That's using the hypnosis and the NLP. We specialize in how to help people go deeper into those experiences and connect to that. Now, does that always solve everything? No. I'm a big proponent in ongoing work. Although some people like to say, cure it in one day. I really believe that, as I said before, I'm self-directed, self-motivated. So creating practices with clients, many times I'll say, what's your takeaway? What are you going to do today? What are you going to do tomorrow? Now, with all that, let's look at the pandemic, because that was a rough time. And let's say past tense was a rough time. And as we know, people still are dealing with either post issues, unfortunately COVID, or, hey, life in general, because stress continues to exist. What I found a big change for me as a psychologist was doing online therapy. That was a big change. I might have done phone sessions. I might have done Skype before, Zoom. But, this is a big, big change. And now with a lot of research saying it's as good as, in person. Does that mean that certain clients prefer in person? Absolutely. Why? Because there's something that happens in the room where you're together with another person. The screen does eliminate, seeing the whole body, feeling what we call energy, right? But nonetheless, it seemed to have been a transition that worked really well for a lot of clients. During that time, there was obviously a lot of isolation. And what are we going to do with isolation? We're going to have to think about resources. We're going to have to think about what can we do with this moment. And inside of my NLP orientation, which, by the way, you could say has some cognitive, some behavioral kind of framework, the question is, how do you frame it? The idea that finally, I don't have to commute. So I didn't have to commute. My clients didn't have to commute. They were able to use their time more efficiently. So you frame it in a different way. And the idea of frame, having a perspective, is often to be able to look at it with more positive eyes, of how you're going to deal with it. Sadly, some people really got ill, and some people had to deal with loss. So there is a variety of ways of, just being there as a support. Sometimes it doesn't matter what technique it's really about empathy. It's really about listening. And that's something that I think any therapist, anybody who wants to go to a therapist would look for also is, how is this person listening to me? And after the listening, though, we say, what is it that you want? What is it that would help you right now? So that we don't just get stuck in the situation. COVID and the pandemic, was a world crisis. And for me as a therapist, I adjusted. And that's what I also expected of my clients, to have flexibility. At some point, the issues started to be issues, not about COVID. Fears started to be more of the issues that would come up. So although the pandemic existed, it was more like, hey, I'm dealing with, I have a presentation. I'm afraid of standing up and, on Zoom now I have to do a presentation. And then it would be, back to the anxiety and the phobias. And I just want to share that I talked about some of the presuppositions of, having the positive intention or understanding resource states or how you frame. Sometimes in the NLP training, we also talk about specific techniques. So, for example, with phobia, somebody has a fear of public speaking. One question is, when did it start? And sometimes it started because somebody was in grade school, they stood up and kids made fun of them, or they felt shame or something like that. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it happens because they're an older in, presenting at work and they didn't understand the information. Whatever it is, there's usually a story. So part of the technique, besides being compassionate to that self, excuse me, is being able to look at it like a movie. So the beginning of a technique is you don't have to relive it. You don't have to start to feel badly about that experience. Look at it like a movie, and interestingly, switch it to black and white. Not everybody can do that. You don't have to be an amazing visualizer, but the concept of what would it be like if you looked at it in black and white and you're observing. And then if you take it one more step away, many people will call this the movie theater technique. Imagine there's a projectionist up here and you're joining the projectionist and you're watching yourself watching the screen. So there are a lot of steps, right? So that's a technique. But before we even do that, we say, take a moment and feel safe. Feel safe where you are right now. And we start to teach how to practice feeling safe, observing from a distance, right? Seeing it in black and white. A lot of steps here. And watch that movie. Watch the movie. And any good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's hard to believe, right? But things do end. You want to remind yourself it ended. And then when you watch it, the first thing we do is like a humanistic piece. What do you know or learn about that character? The one for me, it's not a public speaking, but it was just a difficult situation. I didn't know how to draw the United States when I was a kid. It was it was shameful. I was like 5 years old and we had to draw the United States. So I look at that kid and I think, what do I appreciate about her? And I appreciate that she was willing to say she didn't know. She was willing to be honest, and share that. And I can take a moment, and many people know inner child work. It's so valuable, you know. I don't want it to be like literal. It's like, it's just awareness of caring for a presence within. And by the way, sometimes people forget and they're acting like that's the little child directing them to do the presentation at work. But really, that little child is back there. But appreciating and taking care of that self, that's the beauty of, by the way, of being an adult. You know, that's part of it. It's like if I was working with children, it's a whole different world. But talking to adults, you know, finding your adult self who can handle and look back, that's the beginning of a phobia technique. Now, many people who know NLP know it goes on beyond that. We watch black and white. People in film will know this. You can freeze frame it. You actually imagine it going backwards in color really fast. That's a lot to do with a client. So that takes a little while. But just imagine like that. What is that? Like erasing. So there's a lot of people doing research now on how to do this so that it's not just with phobias, but with trauma. And the idea of reconsolidating the memory. So it's too much to describe really in technique. You can for sure read about the NLP trauma technique. My partner, Stephen Leeds, and I wrote a book called NLP Changing Perspective. We have it in our chapter. You can look it up online. I'm sure there will be something with NLP trauma technique. But it continues that way. And finally, and I think again in terms of film, it's interesting. I don't know why I keep on looking here and here, but I'm looking at the screen, right? And helping this person deal with this like public speaking moment is to edit it, to edit the memory. Say, how would you have liked it to happen? Now, we don't want to have false memory. That's not what we're doing, but to create it so that your body is comfortable. Your mind understands this is not what, really happened. Oh, the kid knew how to draw the United States. She drew it and she won a contest. No, but my body can relax. And so many times we talk about psyche, soma, right? The mind, the body. So we want to have a more relaxed way and then take it back to the person who is getting ready for a public presentation, that they can feel comfortable as an adult presenting, that they're healing the past, they're in the present. So all of that, is a very fast description of a way that I work with phobias. And from all of that, sometimes it's just, a matter of helping somebody to talk about it. I'd say therapy has had so many schools, like theoretical frameworks, but you still want to find trust. If you find trust, like I said before, feeling like you can talk about it with somebody is so important. And in my orientation, we're very outcome oriented. So it's as we build trust, as we connect, how do you want to change? What is it? What's possible? And I believe change is possible. So I find all of this something I do for myself. Yeah. I feel like ultimately we bring our therapy into self-development. And I hope that you all work on yourselves really, really daily. Thank you.